Imagine walking into a high-end restaurant, expecting nothing but great service, only to be met with cold stares and subtle disrespect. Now, what if the man being mistreated wasn't just any customer, but the hidden power behind it all? One arrogant waiter is about to learn a lesson he'll never forget, and it will cost him everything. The dim golden glow of chandeliers bathed Levine in a soft, opulent light. Hushed conversations blended with the gentle clinking of fine crystal, a melody of wealth and exclusivity. This was not just any restaurant, it was an institution of prestige. A haven for those accustomed to service that was as polished as the imported marble floors. Jonathan Carter stepped through the entrance, his presence unassuming yet deliberate. Dressed in a well-worn blazer over a simple button-down, he did not fit the usual mold of Levine's clientele. He had designed it that way. Tonight, he was not the CEO of Carter Hospitality Group. He was not the man whose decisions shaped the very experience this place was known for. He was, for all intents and purposes, just another customer. The shift in atmosphere was immediate. Conversations continued. Servers weaved gracefully between tables. Yet there was something else, an imperceptible pause. A subtle hesitation in the air. A glance exchanged between two hostesses. A raised brow from a bartender polishing a glass. And then there was Richard Collins. Richard, tall and meticulously groomed, exuded the effortless arrogance of someone who had been here long enough to believe he belonged more than most of the guests. He approached Jonathan with a carefully measured indifference. A small, tight smile that did not reach his eyes. "Can I help you?" Jonathan nodded. "I have a reservation." A flicker of surprise crossed Richard's face. Gone as quickly as it appeared. He turned to the sleek podium, scrolling through the guest list with the kind of exaggerated patience reserved for misplaced appointments. "Ah, Carter, is it?" His voice carried the faintest edge of disbelief. "Right this way." Jonathan followed him through the restaurant, past tables adorned with candlelight and murmured affluence. He took in the way Richard's posture remained rigid, the subtle glances cast toward him from a few nearby patrons. He had been in enough rooms like this to recognize the silent language of exclusion. Once at the table, Richard placed the menu in front of him with a casual flick of the wrist. "Our specials tonight," he said flatly, "but you might want to take a look at this side of the menu. Some excellent options that are more practical." Jonathan looked down. The suggested items were notably the least expensive on the menu. His lips pressed together, but his expression remained unreadable. "Appreciate the recommendation," he said smoothly, flipping the menu open. Before he could continue, the entrance doors swung open, and a well-dressed couple strolled in. The woman's diamonds caught the light as she laughed at something her partner whispered. Richard's demeanor shifted instantly. His back straightened, his smile widened, genuine this time. "Welcome back," he greeted them warmly, stepping away from Jonathan's table without another word. Jonathan exhaled slowly, drumming his fingers lightly against the table. He watched as the couple, who had arrived well after him, were escorted to a prime table with immediate service. Time passed. His water glass remained empty. Other tables saw their orders taken, their requests met with warm professionalism. Jonathan waited. When Richard finally returned, it was without apology, without acknowledgement of the delay. "Ready to order?" Jonathan closed the menu. "I'll have the filet, medium rare, and the 2010 Chateau Margaux." Richard's brow lifted. "That's one of our more premium selections. Maybe something a little," he paused, smirking, "more within reach?" Jonathan held his gaze. For the first time, something flickered in his eyes, an intensity sharp enough to silence whatever else Richard had been about to say. "That will be all," he said. Richard hesitated just a second too long before nodding. "Of course." Jonathan leaned back in his chair as the waiter disappeared. He had come here tonight with a purpose: to observe, to see firsthand the truth behind the polished reputation of his restaurant. And what he saw confirmed what he had suspected. From across the room, another man had been watching. Michael Ross, the restaurant's manager, stood near the bar, arms crossed, expression unreadable. He had seen it all, the hesitation, the dismissiveness, the blatant disregard, but he did nothing. Jonathan noted this too. Jonathan sat in silence, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table as he observed the room around him. The murmur of laughter and easy conversation filled the space. A steady rhythm of clinking glasses and whispered toasts. Waiters moved fluidly, refilling wine glasses before they were empty, adjusting silverware with the precision of a well-rehearsed orchestra. Yet, for him, the service remained inexplicably absent. His water glass sat untouched, condensation pooling at its base. He glanced over at a neighboring table where a waiter was presenting a bottle of wine with an air of practiced elegance. Across the room, another couple received their entrees, the plates still steaming from the kitchen. Jonathan glanced down at his own table, no sign of Richard or his order. Minutes stretched. He had no intention of calling for attention. He was here to see how long it would take before someone realized their mistake, before someone corrected what was so obviously wrong. But no one did. Eventually, Richard returned, carrying a plate with all the enthusiasm of a man completing a chore. He placed it in front of Jonathan without so much as a word before turning on his heel. Jonathan let his gaze settle on the dish. The steak, a meal that should have arrived sizzling, was lukewarm at best. He picked up his fork, cut a small piece, and placed it in his mouth. Overcooked. His lips pressed together, not in disappointment. He hadn't expected much, but in quiet confirmation. As he chewed, a group of diners entered. Young, well-dressed, a man in a navy suit guiding his date to a table not far from where Jonathan sat. Within seconds, a different server appeared at their side, smiling warmly. Jonathan watched as they were handed menus, wine glasses filled within moments, their orders taken with an air of welcoming professionalism. Richard finally returned, his expression one of forced politeness. "How's everything tasting?" Jonathan looked up, his expression unreadable. "It's fine." Richard smirked, as if pleased with himself, and reached for the billfold in his apron, ready for the check. Then, Jonathan let a beat pass before he nodded. Richard slipped a small leather folder onto the table but didn't move away. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his smirk deepening. "You sure about this?" he asked, lowering his voice just enough to give the words an edge. "Wouldn't want to bring out something you can't afford." A hush fell over the immediate area. A few patrons turned their heads slightly, pretending not to have heard while stealing sidelong glances. At a nearby table, a young server named Samantha, mid-pour with a bottle of Chardonnay, hesitated just slightly, her hand tightening around the glass. Jonathan held Richard's gaze for a moment longer than necessary, then reached for the bill. With slow, deliberate movements, he pulled out a pen, signed his name, and set it back down. Without a word, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a few bills, laying them neatly on top, more than a fair tip. Then, just as calmly, he reached for the small slip of paper tucked inside the folder and wrote a single sentence. He folded it once, placing it carefully next to the money. Richard barely glanced at it before scooping everything up in one practiced motion. His eyes flicked to the tip, then to Jonathan, as if searching for some reaction. Finding none, he gave a lazy shrug and turned away. As he walked past the server station, he tossed the note into a nearby waste bin without reading it. Behind him, Samantha hesitated. She stole a glance toward Jonathan, who was already rising from his seat, then at the crumpled paper resting on top of discarded receipts. After a brief hesitation, she stepped forward, retrieving it carefully. Her eyes skimmed the writing, and almost instantly, she felt her breath catch. She knew that name. Heart-pounding, she turned, searching the restaurant for Michael Ross. She found him standing near the bar, speaking in low tones to another manager. Clutching the paper tightly, she hurried over, her voice hushed but urgent as she whispered in his ear. Michael frowned, shaking his head. "That can't be right." But when Samantha pressed the note into his palm, his expression changed. He flipped it open, his gaze locking onto the signature at the bottom. The color drained from his face. His head snapped up, searching the dining area, but it was too late. Jonathan Carter was gone. Richard, oblivious, continued to chat idly with a fellow server, basking in his own sense of satisfaction. He had no idea what was coming. Morning light spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Carter Hospitality Group's headquarters, casting long streaks of gold across the polished floors. The building hummed with its usual rhythm, keyboards clicking, phones ringing in hushed conversations, executives moving purposefully from one meeting to the next. Yet, beneath that surface, Something had shifted. There was a tension in the air, a quiet unease rippling through the upper floors. The kind of silence that came before a storm. Jonathan Carter sat at the head of the long conference table, his fingers interlaced in front of him, his expression unreadable. Around him, the senior management team for the company's restaurant division had taken their seats, exchanging brief glances as they settled in. Some were oblivious to the undercurrent of unease, others, like Michael Ross, were acutely aware. Michael had barely slept the moment Samantha had thrust that note into his hands the night before. A deep, sinking feeling had taken hold of him. He had spent the rest of the night convincing himself that this was just a coincidence, that Jonathan's presence at Levine had been nothing more than a personal visit gone unnoticed. But now, as he sat in the room facing his CEO, doubt gnawed at the edges of his confidence. Jonathan scanned the faces in front of him before finally speaking. His voice was calm, steady, but carried the weight of something unspoken. I want a full report on Levine's service quality over the last 6 months, he said. Customer feedback, complaint records, staff performance reviews, everything. The room remained still for a beat too long. Then a few executives began shuffling through their notes. Nodding, Michael Ross kept his expression neutral. Of course, he said smoothly. I'll have my team compile the data for you. Jonathan didn't acknowledge the response. Instead, he leaned back slightly, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make it uncomfortable. Let's talk about service standards, he continued. What is our protocol for handling guest complaints? A woman from the compliance team spoke first, outlining the standard procedures: staff training, incident logging, internal reviews. Jonathan listened carefully, then turned his gaze to Michael. How many formal complaints has Levine received regarding staff conduct in the last 6 months? Michael hesitated for only a second. None that were significant enough to warrant escalation, he replied. Jonathan held his gaze. None? Michael forced an easy smile. Minor incidents, here and there, nothing that would suggest any systemic issues. Across the table, a senior supervisor shifted in his seat. Jonathan noticed. Is that accurate? Jonathan asked, looking toward the supervisor. The man hesitated, then cleared his throat. We have received complaints regarding service inconsistencies, he admitted. Some guests have noted that certain staff members appear less attentive to particular customers. But nothing that. Jonathan raised a hand, cutting him off. How many of those complaints made it past the initial filing stage? A pause. The supervisor looked at Michael, as if searching for permission to continue. Michael's jaw tightened. Some of them were addressed internally. The man finally said, others may not have been logged into the final reports. Jonathan tapped a single finger against the table, his expression still unreadable. So they were removed. No one spoke. Michael straightened slightly in his chair. I assure you, we handle all concerns seriously, he said, but we also filter out cases where complaints seem exaggerated or subjective. We don't want to damage our brand over misunderstandings. Jonathan nodded slowly, as if weighing the response. Understood. The tension in the room eased slightly. Michael exhaled discreetly, convinced that he had navigated the moment. Then Jonathan spoke again. I want every unfiled complaint retrieved. And I want the original versions of the reports, not the edited summaries. Michael's fingers curled slightly against the edge of the table. Of course, he said, his voice measured. I'll see what we can find. Jonathan didn't acknowledge the empty promise. Instead, he let the silence settle again before delivering the final blow. I want every employee at Levine in a mandatory meeting tomorrow, including Richard Collins. A flicker of something passed through Michael's eyes, just for a fraction of a second. But Jonathan caught it. Understood? Michael forced a nod. Understood. Jonathan stood, signaling the end of the meeting. One by one, the executives rose, gathering their things. Michael lingered, watching as Jonathan walked toward the window, his back to the room. He left without another word. Jonathan remained still, staring out at the city below. He had everything he needed now. The storm had arrived. The dining room of Levine was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the usual hum of conversation and clinking glasses. Every employee, from waitstaff to kitchen staff, had been summoned for an unexpected meeting, and uncertainty hung in the air like a thick fog. Whispers passed between small clusters of employees. Theories forming and unraveling in hushed tones. Some believed it was a routine policy update. Others feared layoffs. But the real concern came from the ones who had been there the night before. The ones who had seen the man in the worn blazer and how he had been treated. Richard Collins, oblivious to the nervous energy around him, leaned against the bar, arms crossed, smirking. He recounted his version of the previous night's events to a few fellow servers, embellishing each detail to paint himself as the hero of the encounter. Guy walks in looking like he just wandered in from the subway. He scoffed, shaking his head, tried to order a bottle of wine worth more than his monthly rent. You should have seen his face when I suggested something more reasonable. One of the servers shifted uncomfortably. Another glanced toward the entrance as if expecting someone to walk through it any second. Samantha stood a few feet away, fidgeting with a napkin in her hands. She had spent the entire morning debating whether she should warn Richard. But every time she tried, he waved her off. Now, watching him boast, she knew he wouldn't listen. Before she could try one last time, the front doors opened. Jonathan Carter stepped inside. He was dressed exactly as he had been the night before. Nothing about him suggested power or wealth. But this time, the air around him seemed heavier. The confidence was the same. Yet there was something sharper in his expression. Something unreadable in his measured stride. A ripple of recognition spread through the room. Samantha stiffened. Michael Ross, who had been standing near the kitchen entrance, went pale. Several employees turned to each other, whispering. But Richard, still caught in the momentum of his own story, hadn't noticed. Jonathan walked past the bar, stopping a few feet away. He looked directly at Richard. "Do you recognize me?" Richard blinked, momentarily thrown off. He let out a short, awkward chuckle. "I don't think we've met, sir." Jonathan tilted his head slightly, as if considering something. "No, I believe you served me last night." The room fell into complete silence. Michael Ross inhaled sharply. Samantha swallowed hard. A few servers exchanged wide-eyed glances. But Richard, still not fully comprehending the situation, forced another smirk. "If you say so." He let out a dry laugh. "Hope the service was up to your expectations." Jonathan reached into his pocket and pulled out a neatly folded piece of paper. He set it down on the bar, unfolding it with deliberate care. There, in bold ink, was his signature, clear, undeniable, and final. Richard's eyes dropped to the paper. His smirk faltered. Jonathan turned slightly, shifting his attention toward Michael Ross. "You told me there were no serious complaints about service at Levine," he said, his tone conversational, almost polite. "It appears we've had a misunderstanding." Michael opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His hands tightened into fists at his sides. Jonathan didn't wait for an excuse. He turned back to Richard, his voice calm, steady, but laced with authority. "You're dismissed, effective immediately." Richard's face went slack. He let out a small, incredulous laugh, glancing around as if expecting someone to correct what had to be a mistake. "Wait, what? You can't be serious." Jonathan didn't respond. Michael Ross took a small step forward, attempting to salvage the moment. "Jonathan." Jonathan raised a hand, silencing him. "Michael, you're suspended pending a full internal review. If I find that reports were altered or complaints ignored, you won't be coming back." Michael's mouth snapped shut. Jonathan turned toward the rest of the room, his gaze sweeping over the assembled employees. "Changes are coming," he said. "From this moment forward, all staff will undergo mandatory training on service standards and non-discrimination policies. A direct reporting system will be implemented for both employees and customers. And unannounced inspections will be conducted by senior management. That includes me." A murmur spread through the crowd. Some nodded in approval. Others exchanged uncertain looks. Richard was still standing there, his face flushed with anger. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath. Jonathan turned back to him. "If you think that, then you were never meant to be here in the first place." Two security personnel, discreetly positioned near the entrance, moved forward. Richard stiffened as they flanked him. His bravado cracked, his protests reduced to a low grumble as they led him toward the door. Michael Ross remained where he stood, his face unreadable. He knew he wouldn't be dragged out like Richard. but the weight of what had just happened settled in his gut like a stone. Jonathan took one last look around. He didn't need to say anything else. The message had been delivered. Then, with the same quiet authority he had walked in with, he turned and stepped back out into the city. This time, he was not just a guest. This time, he was a man reclaiming his own house. A week had passed since the events at Levine, but the echoes of that night had only grown louder. What had begun as an internal shake-up was now a topic of discussion far beyond the walls of Carter Hospitality Group. Employees whispered in hallways. Industry insiders speculated over quiet lunches. And in the world of finance and hospitality, where reputation meant everything, the name Jonathan Carter had never carried more weight. The story had started small, a few murmurs among staff, a handful of patrons recounting what they had witnessed. But social media had a way of amplifying the extraordinary. A single tweet had set off a wildfire. CEO of Carter Hospitality Group went undercover at his own restaurant and witnessed discrimination firsthand. Fired the employee on the spot. This is leadership. Within hours, it had been shared thousands of times. Comments flooded in, ranging from praise to skepticism. Some called Jonathan a visionary. Others accused him of grandstanding. Then came the news outlets. Business journals framed it as a bold leadership move, a masterclass in hands-on management. Hospitality magazines dissected what it meant for high-end service standards. Financial analysts speculated on the long-term impact on Carter Hospitality's stock value. Even mainstream news stations picked it up, slotting it between national headlines. Back at company headquarters, the reaction among employees was mixed. For some, the changes felt like long overdue justice. Waitstaff and junior managers who had quietly endured toxic work environments suddenly saw a shift in power. A silent weight had lifted, as if the invisible rules of the game had been rewritten overnight. But not everyone welcomed the change. In boardrooms and executive offices, tension simmered. Some senior managers, the ones accustomed to operating without scrutiny, saw this as a direct threat to their authority. If Jonathan Carter could walk into one of his own restaurants unannounced and dismantle careers overnight, who was to say they wouldn't be next? No one voiced their dissent openly, at least not yet. But behind closed doors, alliances were being tested, and one man in particular was determined to tip the balance back in his favor. Robert Langley had spent decades climbing the corporate ladder, maneuvering through boardroom politics with the precision of a chess master. As Chief Operating Officer of Carter Hospitality Group, he had cultivated influence over key managers like Michael Ross, ensuring that certain decisions always leaned in his favor. Michael's suspension had been an inconvenience. His firing would be unacceptable. Langley was not the kind of man who confronted problems head-on. He preferred pressure, persuasion, the quiet application of leverage until things fell into place. Over the past few days, he had met privately with select board members, sowing seeds of doubt. Jonathan Carter's actions, he argued, had been impulsive, emotional, good for headlines, perhaps, but reckless in the long run. Investors valued stability. If Jonathan kept making unilateral decisions based on sentiment rather than strategy, how long before the company suffered real consequences? Langley wasn't asking for Jonathan to be removed. Not yet, but he was making sure the right people were watching, waiting for a misstep. Jonathan, however, was already moving ahead. He had spent the past week laying the groundwork for the next phase of his plan. Change wasn't just about punishing bad behavior, it was about restructuring the system that had allowed it to thrive in the first place. The conference room was full when Jonathan walked in, the chatter among executives ceasing almost immediately. He took his seat at the head of the table, his gaze sweeping across the room, reading the room the way a seasoned dealer reads a card table. He knew who was here to listen. He knew who was here to resist. Without preamble, he began. Effective immediately. We're implementing a real-time customer feedback system across all Carter Hospitality restaurants. Guests will be able to submit their experience ratings before they leave the table. Any recurring issues will trigger an automatic internal review. A murmur spread through the room. Some nodded in agreement. Others exchanged wary glances. We're also launching a company-wide retraining program over the next 60 days. Every employee, from frontline staff to senior management, will participate in new service standards and ethics training. This will not be optional. That sent a ripple of discomfort through the group. A few executives shifted in their seats. Jonathan let the silence hang for a moment before delivering the final blow. And if any manager feels that these standards are unreasonable, I won't stand in their way if they choose to leave. The tension in the room sharpened. Some looked away. A few met his gaze with careful neutrality. Jonathan wasn't issuing a threat, he was offering a choice. Adapt or step aside. Then Robert Langley spoke. These are significant changes, he said smoothly, his voice carrying the practiced ease of a man used to controlling the conversation. And while I respect the intention behind them, we have to consider the broader impact. What message are we sending to our clientele? Many of our guests expect a certain level of exclusivity. If we disrupt that balance, we risk alienating a core segment of our business. Jonathan leaned back slightly, studying him. Langley continued, there's also the financial aspect. Major shifts like this come at a cost. Retraining programs, real-time feedback systems, they're expensive. And some of our investors are already expressing concerns about the way recent events have been handled. If we lose their confidence, it won't matter how well-intentioned these policies are. A calculated move. Langley wasn't directly opposing Jonathan, he was planting doubt, positioning himself as the voice of reason. Jonathan nodded, as if considering it. Then he smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. You're right, these changes will cost money. But do you know what costs more? Lawsuits, reputation damage, losing trust, not just from investors, but from the customers who keep this company running. Langley's expression remained neutral, but Jonathan saw the slight tightening of his jaw. This isn't about exclusivity, Jonathan continued. It's about ensuring that everyone who walks into our restaurants is treated with the same level of respect and service. That's not negotiable. Silence stretched between them. Jonathan turned his attention back to the room. We move forward as planned. Langley didn't argue, but Jonathan knew this wasn't over. The battle had only begun. The changes Jonathan Carter had set in motion were not met with universal acceptance. On the surface, things appeared to be shifting in the right direction, employees attending retraining sessions, customer feedback systems being installed, management teams adjusting policies. But underneath, a quiet resistance was growing. Some restaurant managers, the ones who had operated under the old system for years, weren't embracing the new policies as Jonathan had intended. Instead, they found ways to stall. Schedules for retraining were suddenly too difficult to coordinate. Complaints that should have been escalated now didn't meet the threshold for investigation. Behind closed doors, conversations about the company's future were held in hushed tones. And the phrase, "This will blow over," was spoken with increasing frequency. It wasn't just passive resistance. Some employees, especially those who had thrived in the old culture, were being pressured to push back. Rumors started circulating, whispers that the new policies were temporary, that the board wasn't fully behind Jonathan, that things would return to normal soon enough. And at the center of this whisper campaign was Michael Ross. Despite his suspension, Michael had not faded into the background. He had spent years cultivating relationships within Carter Hospitality, ensuring that his influence extended beyond just Levine. Now, he was using those connections to undermine Jonathan's authority from the shadows. Through back-channel communications, he urged employees to push against the changes, to ignore the new policies when possible. He painted Jonathan as an outsider within his own company, a man who was dismantling something that had taken years to build. But Michael wasn't acting alone. He had reached out to Robert Langley. The meeting took place in the private lounge of an exclusive club, dimly lit, with leather chairs and hushed conversations where real power moved behind the scenes. Michael sat across from Langley, his confidence shaken but not broken. He needed Langley's backing, and he was willing to do whatever it took to get it. "This whole thing is getting out of hand," Michael said, his voice low but firm. "Jonathan is overreaching. He's turning this company into a social experiment instead of running it like a business." Langley swirled the amber liquid in his glass, watching Michael carefully. "And what exactly do you want me to do about it?" Michael leaned forward. "We both know the board is getting nervous. We just need to push them over the edge. If you apply the right pressure, they'll act, and when that happens, we can put things back in order." Langley studied him, considering the implications. He had his own reasons for wanting Jonathan out of the way. But he wasn't reckless. If he moved against Jonathan too soon, it could backfire. He needed leverage. "I'll handle the board," Langley said finally. "You just make sure the employees don't get too comfortable with these new policies. The more chaotic things seem, the easier it will be to convince people that Jonathan isn't fit to lead." Over the next few days, Langley put his plan into motion. He arranged discreet meetings with key shareholders, carefully framing his concerns. He wasn't directly opposing Jonathan, of course. No, he was simply looking out for the company's best interests. A CEO who made decisions based on personal sentiment rather than financial strategy. That was dangerous. Investors needed stability, not unpredictability. Langley's influence spread. He spoke to journalists off the record, feeding them just enough to stir doubt. Soon, headlines began appearing in industry publications, questioning whether Carter Hospitality's leadership was becoming too reactive. Then, the article appeared. It was published in a respected financial journal, the kind that investors and executives read over morning coffee. The piece was carefully crafted, not an outright attack, but a well-researched exposé on how certain hospitality companies had been altering customer complaint data to maintain their elite reputation. It never mentioned Carter Hospitality by name, but the implications were clear. The article described how complaints about discriminatory service had been systematically buried in company reports, how upper management had overlooked red flags for years, and it hinted, ever so subtly, that these practices had been tolerated at the highest levels of leadership. The effect was immediate. That morning, Jonathan's phone lit up with messages from board members, advisors, and media contacts. Investors wanted answers. Employees were shaken. And before the day was over, Jonathan received an official notice from the board. An emergency meeting had been scheduled. The boardroom at Carter Hospitality Group's headquarters was a stark contrast to the restaurants it oversaw. No soft candlelight, no carefully curated ambiance, just the cool glow of recessed lighting and the weight of power concentrated around a long, polished table. It was a room where decisions were made, fortunes were built or dismantled, and, on this particular day, where Jonathan Carter would face his greatest challenge since taking over as CEO. Every seat was occupied. Eleanor Briggs, the chairwoman, sat at the head of the table, her expression as unreadable as ever. Jonathan took his usual seat, his presence commanding yet calm. Across from him sat Robert Langley, poised with the confidence of a man who had stacked the deck in his favor. The remaining board members were a mix, some allies, some doubters, and a handful of silent observers waiting to see which way the wind would blow. Langley wasted no time. The moment Eleanor called the meeting to order, he leaned forward, his voice smooth, practiced. "Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the obvious. We're at a crossroads. Carter Hospitality has always been a leader in fine dining and luxury service. But recent decisions have put us in a precarious position." He glanced around the table, letting the weight of his words settle. "While I respect Jonathan's vision, we can't ignore the consequences of these abrupt changes. Employee morale is shaken. Longtime customers are voicing concerns. And let's not forget the numbers." He tapped a folder in front of him, sliding it toward the center of the table. "Levine's revenue has dropped 6% in the last week alone. Other locations are seeing similar trends. We built this company on a foundation of exclusivity and exceptional service. If we alienate our core clientele, we risk undermining everything we've worked for." Jonathan listened without reaction. He had expected this. Langley using selective data to frame his argument, painting a picture of instability and decline. One of the board members, a longtime investor named Franklin Walsh, frowned as he reviewed the documents. "Robert, are we certain this dip in revenue is tied to policy changes? It's been a single week. Trends fluctuate." Langley nodded, feigning understanding. "Of course, Franklin. But perception is reality in this industry. We need to consider the long-term impact." He turned his gaze to Jonathan, his smile thin. "Surely, our CEO can acknowledge that?" Jonathan finally spoke. "I don't dispute that change comes with challenges. But let's talk about perception. Specifically, whose perception we're prioritizing." He reached for a tablet and tapped the screen. The monitor behind him flickered to life, displaying a series of reports, emails, And internal memos. For years, complaints about service discrepancies have been buried. Jonathan continued. Concerns about discriminatory treatment, unprofessional behavior, outright misconduct, all dismissed before they ever reached this table. Why? Because someone decided it was better for business to ignore the problem than to fix it. The silence in the room sharpened. Several board members leaned in, scanning the data before them. A few exchanged uncertain glances. Jonathan pressed on. Financially, the impact of these cover-ups has been substantial. We've issued quiet refunds to VIP customers to avoid bad press. We've lost high-value clientele due to inconsistent service standards. We've settled internal disputes that never should have existed in the first place. If we're discussing revenue loss, let's discuss the money we've already lost by pretending these problems didn't exist. Langley's jaw tightened. This is an oversimplification. We handle concerns as they arise. No system is perfect. Jonathan tapped another document onto the screen. This is an internal memo from Michael Ross, dated just 2 months ago. It explicitly instructs senior staff to filter complaints that could negatively impact the brand. A ripple of murmurs moved through the room. Eleanor Briggs remained still, her eyes locked on the screen. Jonathan turned back to Langley. You claim I'm the one putting this company at risk. But tell me, Robert, who benefits from a system where misconduct is swept under the rug? Who profits from deception? Langley's mask of control slipped for just a moment, a flicker of irritation crossing his face before he recovered. Jonathan, you're making this personal. We should be discussing solutions, not assigning blame. Jonathan smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Oh, I have solutions. But first, let's talk about your campaign to undermine my leadership. Langley stiffened. Jonathan continued, his voice unwavering. In the past 2 weeks, you've had private meetings with at least 4 board members, suggesting that my leadership is unstable. You've spoken with media contacts to frame our policy changes as reckless. And let's not forget your discussions with Michael Ross, the same man who actively worked to suppress internal reports. More murmurs. Some members visibly tensed, glancing at Langley, waiting for his response. Langley's voice was measured, but there was an edge beneath it. These are serious accusations. Jonathan, if you have evidence, present it. Jonathan met his gaze evenly. That won't be necessary. I trust the board can draw their own conclusions. Eleanor Briggs finally spoke. Her voice was calm, but there was an authority in it that silenced the room instantly. Enough. She let the words settle before continuing. I've heard both sides. It's clear that we're facing challenges. But it's also clear that those challenges stem from long-standing practices, not just from recent decisions. She exhaled slowly, as if weighing her next words carefully. The time for debate is over. We need to decide, does Jonathan continue as CEO? Or do we take this company in a different direction? The room seemed to shrink. The moment had arrived. Langley straightened, smoothing his tie. I motion for a vote. Jonathan folded his hands on the table, waiting. He had said everything he needed to. Now, it was out of his hands. Eleanor nodded. Then we vote. The boardroom was silent, except for the sound of pens tapping against the polished oak table and the occasional rustling of paper. The air was thick with tension, the kind that only existed when the future of an empire was being decided behind closed doors. Each member of the board held a single sheet of paper in their hands, a simple ballot with 2 choices. Support Jonathan Carter as CEO or remove him from his position. No discussion, no deliberation, just a decision. Jonathan sat motionless at the head of the table, his hands clasped together, his expression unreadable. To his right, Eleanor Briggs remained composed, her fingers steepled as she observed the proceedings. Across the table, Robert Langley leaned back in his chair, his confidence carefully measured, but Jonathan could see the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers drummed lightly against the table's edge. Langley had played this game for too long to show outright emotion. But he had expected to have more control over this vote. The ballots were collected one by one, placed into a single folder, and handed to Eleanor. She opened it slowly, taking her time, her gaze flicking from one line to the next. The room felt smaller with each passing second. She looked up. 8 votes in favor of Jonathan Carter remaining as CEO. Her voice was steady, but the weight of the decision made it seem louder than it was. 6 votes against. For a moment, there was no reaction. No one moved. Then it happened. A sharp exhale from one of the board members. A shift in Langley's expression. Just a flicker of disbelief before he schooled his features back into neutrality. The man who had orchestrated months of resistance, who had carefully maneuvered behind the scenes, had lost. Jonathan didn't let himself react immediately. Instead, he sat still, absorbing the numbers, feeling the weight of what they meant. It was a victory, but a narrow one. The kind of win that didn't end a war, only bought more time. Eleanor cleared her throat. Jonathan retains his position as CEO. She confirmed, her tone formal, final. However, given the concerns raised, the board requests a comprehensive plan outlining the next phase of restructuring within 30 days. Jonathan inclined his head. Understood. Langley leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. We all want this company to succeed, he said, his voice smooth, practiced. I trust you'll consider the long-term financial impact of these policies as you move forward. It was a veiled threat, an indication that this fight wasn't over. Jonathan met his gaze without blinking. I always consider the long term. There was nothing more to be said. The meeting should have ended there. But Jonathan wasn't finished. He reached into his briefcase, pulling out a folder that looked nearly identical to the one used for the votes. He placed it on the table, sliding it toward Eleanor. Before we adjourn, I have one more matter to address. Eleanor gave him a questioning look but opened the folder without protest. Her brow furrowed as she read the first page, then the second. What is this? One of the board members asked. Noticing her reaction, Jonathan's voice was calm, measured. A full internal audit of management practices within Carter Hospitality Group. Specifically, practices that have compromised the integrity of our brand. The tension in the room tightened like a noose. These documents contain evidence of deliberate manipulation of financial records, suppression of customer complaints, and the mismanagement of multiple restaurant locations. Jonathan continued. Some of these violations were allowed to persist because certain individuals within leadership ensured they never reached the board. Langley sat up straighter, his jaw tightening. Jonathan flipped to a specific page and turned it so the entire table could see. Michael Ross personally instructed staff to filter complaints related to service discrimination. He also engaged in discussions with former employees, encouraging them to sabotage our restructuring efforts. A murmur spread through the room. One board member shifted uncomfortably, while another leaned in, eyes narrowing as they scanned the evidence. Jonathan didn't stop there. Robert Langley, in his capacity as COO, was aware of these issues. Instead of addressing them, he facilitated cover-ups to protect certain managers from scrutiny. He also used his influence to pressure employees into resisting policy changes that were meant to restore credibility to this company. Langley's fingers curled into a fist against the table. This is a baseless attack. Jonathan turned another page. Would you like me to go over the financial discrepancies in the reports you personally approved? Silence. Eleanor exhaled slowly. Setting the documents down, she turned toward Langley. Do you have a response? Langley didn't answer immediately. He knew he couldn't refute what was in front of him. He could try to spin it, downplay it, push the blame onto others. But the board was watching. More importantly, Jonathan was watching. Finally, he forced a tight smile. If mistakes were made, I trust we'll address them appropriately. Jonathan held his gaze for a long moment before looking back at the board. I motion for a second vote. One to determine the employment status of Michael Ross and the operational authority of Robert Langley moving forward. Eleanor glanced around the table. No one objected. The second vote was quicker. Michael Ross is officially terminated. Effective immediately. No one spoke in his defense. Langley wasn't as easy to remove. His position as COO gave him leverage, and some board members were reluctant to dismantle leadership entirely. Robert Langley will remain with the company, Eleanor stated. However, his authority will be restricted, pending further review. Langley rose from his chair, adjusting his suit with slow, deliberate movements. He didn't look at Jonathan. Not directly, but there was something in his expression, cold, unreadable, but dangerous. He had lost this round, but he was not a man who accepted defeat easily. Without another word, he walked out. Jonathan sat back, exhaling. He had won, not just his position, but the power to continue what he had started. Yet, as the room slowly emptied, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. The morning after the board meeting, Jonathan Carter was already at his desk before the city fully woke. The skyline of New York stretched beyond his window, a reminder of the empire he was fighting to rebuild from the inside out. The battle for control wasn't over, it had only just begun. His first order of business was assembling a task force, a select team of forensic accountants, compliance officers, and operations specialists. Their mission was clear: conduct a sweeping audit across every Carter hospitality property. No more selective reporting, no more sanitized complaints. The era of looking the other way was over. By noon, directives had been issued to every restaurant under the company's umbrella. All financial records, staffing reports, and customer complaints were to be submitted in full, with no alterations. A confidential hotline was launched, allowing employees to anonymously report misconduct at any level of the organization. Managers who had grown accustomed to skimming the surface were about to be forced into the deep end. Not everyone welcomed the scrutiny. Across the city, in the quiet seclusion of a private club, Robert Langley was already setting his counterattack in motion. The sting of his defeat hadn't faded, but neither had his resolve. Jonathan Carter had won the vote, but Langley knew that power wasn't always about the numbers in a boardroom. Power was perception, and perception could be manipulated. Seated in a dimly lit booth, he listened as a handful of his most trusted allies, senior managers who still owed him their loyalty, reported back. "We're stalling as much as we can," one of them muttered, submitting incomplete reports, dragging our feet on requests. "But Carter's team is relentless. If we keep resisting, they'll catch on." Langley nodded, considering. "Then we make it about something bigger. The moment this turns into a battle between Carter and his employees, we win." He leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. "Start spreading the word. The new policies are unsustainable. Let the staff believe that they're being pushed too hard, that the company is moving too fast, that the future under Carter means instability. People fear change when it feels like it's out of their control." The managers exchanged glances but nodded. The seeds had been planted. Now, it was just a matter of waiting for the doubt to take root. By the time Jonathan's team began collecting their first round of findings, the backlash had already begun. Anonymous complaints surfaced, claiming that the increased oversight was creating a toxic work environment. Some employees, pressured by Langley's faction, voiced frustration that longtime managers were being forced out. And then came the headlines. A prominent business journal ran an article that morning with a carefully worded headline: "Exclusive. Internal turmoil at Carter Hospitality. Are drastic changes putting employees at risk?" The piece was surgical in its framing. It acknowledged Jonathan's reforms but painted them as aggressive, destabilizing. It included vague references to anonymous sources, claiming that morale was at an all-time low. That staff feared retaliation for speaking out. The underlying message was clear: Jonathan Carter was pushing too hard, too fast, and it was starting to crack the foundation of his company. Jonathan read the article twice, then set it down without a word. It wasn't just an attack, it was a warning. Langley was reminding him that control wasn't something you seized in a meeting, it was something you had to fight for every single day. The implications were immediate. That afternoon, a few board members reached out, their concerns masked behind carefully measured tones. Investors were growing uneasy. If the narrative wasn't contained, it could impact stock value. One even suggested that Jonathan consider easing the transition to avoid alienating senior leadership. It was exactly what Langley wanted. By evening, Jonathan had called an emergency meeting with key stakeholders. The pressure was mounting. If he couldn't shift the momentum back in his favor, the power he had fought to hold onto could start slipping through his fingers. Jonathan Carter sat in his office, staring at the skyline beyond the glass. The city was alive with conversations he couldn't hear, opinions being formed in real time. He had fought wars in boardrooms, behind closed doors where battles were won through numbers and persuasion. But this wasn't just about numbers anymore. This was a war for perception. And Robert Langley had fired the first shot. The article had done its damage. Investors were uneasy. Employees were on edge. The narrative that Langley and his allies had spun, painting Jonathan as an overreaching dictator. Dismantling the company on a personal crusade was gaining traction. If he didn't shift the momentum, it wouldn't matter that he had won the board vote. A leader without trust was just a figurehead waiting to be replaced. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. Set up an exclusive with the Wall Street Ledger. I want the interview scheduled for tomorrow morning. The response on the other end was cautious. That's aggressive. We haven't even done damage control yet. That is damage control, Jonathan said. I'm not going to let them control the story. We tell it ourselves. The next morning, he walked into the offices of the Wall Street Ledger, greeted by a sea of journalists who had spent the past week dissecting his every move. The editor-in-chief himself had agreed to conduct the interview, a sign that the story had become too big to ignore. The moment the cameras started rolling, Jonathan took control. He didn't wait for the interviewer to ask about the controversy, he brought it up himself. There's been a lot of speculation about what's happening at Carter Hospitality, he said, his voice even but firm. Let's set the record straight. He laid out the facts. The years of buried complaints, the manipulated reports, the systemic issues that had been ignored in the name of short-term profits. He spoke not just as a CEO, but as someone who had built this company from the ground up. Someone who understood what was truly at stake. This isn't about disruption for the sake of it, he said. It's about integrity. Carter Hospitality Group isn't just a business, it's a brand that stands for excellence. And excellence doesn't mean turning a blind eye when something is broken. It means fixing it. Then came the moment Langley hadn't anticipated. Jonathan reached into the folder beside him and pulled out a stack of papers. These are the real numbers, he said, holding them up, not the cherry-picked data you've seen floating around. Here's what's actually happening. He revealed an internal audit that had been conducted in the past week, showing that while some revenue fluctuations had occurred, overall customer satisfaction was rising. Complaints about service inconsistencies had dropped in locations that had already implemented the new policies. And most importantly, a surge in positive feedback was coming from employees who finally felt like they were being heard. Then he delivered the final blow. We also have evidence of intentional interference in this process, Jonathan said, setting down the final page. Certain individuals who benefited from the old system have been working behind the scenes to undermine these changes. That stops now. The interview aired that evening. Within hours, the backlash against Jonathan started to shift. Customers voiced support, praising him for taking a stand. Former employees who had left due to the toxic environment began sharing their own stories. A letter signed by over 100 current employees circulated online, thanking Jonathan for his leadership. Langley's grip on his network of loyalists started to slip. The managers who had once hesitated now saw the tide turning and began complying with Jonathan's reforms. But the real blow came from within. At the next board meeting, several members who had previously sided with Langley expressed concerns. The instability, they argued, wasn't coming from Jonathan's policies, it was coming from the resistance against them. Investors who had been skeptical now saw Langley as a liability rather than an asset. That's when the vote was called. Not to remove Jonathan, but to determine whether Robert Langley should remain in his position at all. Jonathan sat back, watching as the man who had tried to orchestrate his downfall was now fighting to keep his own footing. He wasn't going to interfere. The numbers, the truth, and Langley's own arrogance had done the work for him. He had one final move left to play. And it was checkmate. The boardroom at Carter Hospitality Group had seen many battles, but none as decisive as the one unfolding now. The air was thick with anticipation, a silent tension stretching between the seated figures. No one spoke as Eleanor Briggs, the chairwoman, called the meeting to order. Jonathan Carter sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable, a stack of documents neatly arranged in front of him. Across from him, Robert Langley leaned back in his chair, his usual confidence intact, but there was something different in his posture. The weight of the past few weeks had taken its toll. He was still playing the role of the assured executive, but even he knew that his grip was slipping. Eleanor's voice broke the silence. We're here today to discuss allegations of misconduct within Carter Hospitality's leadership. Jonathan, as CEO, you've requested this session to present your findings. You have the floor. Jonathan nodded, picking up the first document. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The truth would do the work for him. For months, this company has been engaged in a battle, not just over policy, but over integrity. He began. I've spent the past several weeks implementing reforms to correct years of mismanagement. But at every turn, those efforts have been met with resistance. Today, I'm going to show you why. He placed the first file in front of Eleanor and gestured for the documents to be distributed. One by one, the board members flipped open the pages. The numbers, once hidden, were now in plain sight. This is a financial audit of several of our highest performing restaurants. Jonathan continued. At first glance, they appear profitable, but when cross-referenced with our internal records, we found significant discrepancies. A few board members murmured. Exchanging glances, Jonathan tapped the next document. These discrepancies were not errors. They were deliberate. Profits were being manipulated, reports were altered, and financial statements were adjusted to conceal unauthorized transactions. Langley remained silent, but Jonathan saw his fingers tighten against the armrest of his chair. Jonathan lifted another set of papers. Next, we have internal emails. These messages, sent between Robert Langley and several managers, detail explicit instructions to stall the implementation of new policies. He encouraged delays, spread misinformation among employees, and directly undermined leadership decisions. A few board members shook their heads, whispering among themselves. Jonathan wasn't finished. And finally, he said, reaching for the last file, "We have this." He pressed a button on his tablet, and the speakers in the room came to life. The audio quality was clear, too clear for anyone to deny its authenticity. Langley's voice filled the room, sharp and deliberate. "The board is weak. Carter is reckless. We need to push the narrative that he's out of control. Keep leaking complaints. Make it seem like the company is crumbling. Once investors start pulling out, they'll have no choice but to remove him." A heavy silence followed. Langley's face darkened, but he didn't look away. Eleanor exhaled, her expression hardening. "Robert, do you have a response to this?" Langley straightened his tie, his voice calm but edged with defiance. "This is being taken out of context. Every company has internal discussions about strategy." Jonathan cut him off. "This wasn't strategy. This was sabotage." A few members of the board nodded in agreement. Others remained unreadable, but the shift in the room was undeniable. Eleanor glanced around the table before speaking again. "It's clear that this company cannot move forward under divided leadership. We will now vote on the removal of Robert Langley from his position as Chief Operating Officer." Langley's jaw tensed, but he said nothing. He knew the numbers weren't in his favor this time. One by one, the board members cast their votes. There was no hesitation, no second guessing. 12 votes in favor of termination. 1 abstention. Eleanor set down her pen. "Robert Langley is hereby removed from his position. Effective immediately. Security will escort him from the premises. A formal investigation into financial misconduct will begin immediately." The decision was final. Langley didn't protest. He didn't beg. He simply rose from his chair, adjusted his cuffs, and gave Jonathan one last, measured look before walking toward the door. There was no victory in his step, only the weight of a man who had lost everything. The doors closed behind him. Jonathan exhaled, but there was no satisfaction in it. He had won, but the work was far from over. The company still needed rebuilding. The trust of employees and investors still needed to be restored. But for the first time in a long time, the path forward was finally clear. The air in Carter Hospitality Group's headquarters was different now. The tension that had once loomed over every executive meeting, every managerial decision, had lifted. With Robert Langley gone, the company had taken its first real step toward the future Jonathan Carter had envisioned. But the work was far from over. In the days following Langley's removal, a series of structural changes were put into motion. A new chief operating officer was appointed, Daniel Whitmore, a seasoned executive with a reputation for fairness and integrity. Unlike Langley, Daniel had no interest in playing political games. He had spent years advocating for ethical business practices. And now, he was ready to help Jonathan rebuild the company from the inside out. The new policies, once met with skepticism, were now fully implemented. Every restaurant in the Carter Hospitality Network was required to follow a transparent reporting system. Customer complaints could no longer be swept under the rug. A new hiring process was introduced, ensuring that diversity and inclusion weren't just buzzwords but actual commitments backed by action. Staff training programs were revamped, not just to improve service but to reinforce a culture of accountability. Perhaps the most significant change was the formation of an independent oversight committee. Composed of legal experts, industry professionals, and employee representatives, this body would ensure that no future executive, no matter how powerful, could manipulate the system the way Langley had. Not everyone embraced the changes immediately. Some of the old guard managers quietly left, realizing that the new environment would no longer tolerate the habits they had grown comfortable with. Others stayed, adapting, some begrudgingly, some with a renewed sense of purpose. Michael Ross, however, wouldn't be given a second chance. His termination was made permanent, and a quiet but firm industry-wide notice ensured that no major hospitality group would take him in. He had been the embodiment of the system's worst failures, and Jonathan had no intention of letting him re-emerge elsewhere to repeat the same cycle. At the restaurant level, shifts in leadership had an immediate impact. Some of the more problematic figures were replaced or reassigned, but the biggest change came for those who had stood on the right side of history. Samantha, the young waitress who had risked speaking out, was promoted to a training manager role. She would now be responsible for teaching new hires the principles of service, not just etiquette and efficiency, but respect and dignity for every guest. One evening, Jonathan returned to Levine. This time, it wasn't to test the system. He wasn't there to catch anyone off guard. He simply wanted to see, firsthand, what had changed. As he stepped inside, the atmosphere felt different. The tension from his last visit was gone. Staff moved with purpose, treating each guest with the same level of care and professionalism. The energy in the room was lighter. Not forced, not artificial, just genuine. A new waiter approached his table, a young man in his early 20s, polite but unaware of Jonathan's identity. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to Levine. Can I get you started with something to drink?" Jonathan smiled. No hesitation, no assumptions, no sideways glances. "Surprise me," he said. The waiter nodded and walked off, and Jonathan leaned back in his chair. This was what it was all about. Not the corporate battles, not the headlines, not the votes in the boardroom. This moment, a place where anyone could walk in and be treated with dignity, was why he had fought. His phone buzzed. A message from Eleanor Briggs. "We did it, but don't forget, the fight for justice never truly ends." Jonathan looked out the window. The city stretching before him, full of challenges yet to come. He had won this battle, but there would always be more. And he was ready. A month had passed since Robert Langley had been removed, and Carter Hospitality Group was beginning to find its rhythm again. The worst of the internal resistance had settled, and operations were stabilizing under the new policies. Yet, Jonathan Carter knew that change on this scale didn't happen overnight. The dust might have settled, but the ground beneath was still shifting. The media had not let go of the story. Headlines ranged from praise to skepticism, each trying to frame the company's transformation in their own way. Some publications called Jonathan a bold leader, a man willing to dismantle a corrupt system from the inside. Others questioned the long-term viability of his approach, suggesting that the rapid changes could weaken Carter Hospitality's position in an already competitive industry. A New York Times article titled "Carter Hospitality: Reform or Self-Destruction" caught Jonathan's attention. The piece acknowledged the improvements in customer experience and transparency but speculated on whether the disruption would ultimately hurt profitability. One quote from an anonymous former executive suggested that Jonathan had been too focused on morality and not enough on business. He set the paper aside. He had expected this. No real change came without backlash. Inside the company, the atmosphere had shifted. There were still murmurs of dissatisfaction among some longtime employees who resisted the new structure. But the majority of the workforce had started to adapt. A recent internal survey showed that customer satisfaction ratings had increased by 23%. A significant jump. However, revenue had dipped slightly due to the restructuring efforts and adjustments in service protocols. Some investors remained wary, but Jonathan was willing to take short-term losses for long-term stability. He had started to believe that the hardest part was over. Then, the report arrived. A manila folder sat on his desk. delivered by the company's internal financial investigation team. Jonathan flipped it open and immediately felt his stomach tighten. The numbers didn't add up. Robert Langley hadn't just been a problem in the boardroom. He had been moving money in ways that weren't just unethical, but illegal. Large sums had been funneled through subsidiary accounts, transferred to outside entities just before his departure. On paper, they looked like standard investment transactions. But the deeper the investigators had dug, the more irregularities they had found. If they were right, this wasn't just mismanagement, it was embezzlement. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, processing the implications. Langley had known his time was running out. While he was busy fighting for control, he had also been covering his tracks, securing financial escape routes. If they pursued this, it wouldn't just end in corporate sanctions, it could mean legal action, even criminal charges. He picked up the phone and dialed Daniel Whitmore, the newly appointed COO. "Get the legal team and external auditors into my office within the hour. We have a situation." There was another concern weighing on him. Langley had been cunning, but he hadn't done this alone. Moving this amount of money required cooperation, coordination. Someone else in the company, or beyond it, had been helping him. Jonathan closed the file, his jaw tightening. He had won the first battle, but the war wasn't over. Jonathan Carter sat at the head of the long conference table, his fingers lightly tapping against the folder in front of him. The room was filled with a mix of legal counsel, forensic accountants, and members of the executive team. They were here for answers. And from the tension in the air, it was clear no one was expecting good news. Daniel Whitmore, the newly appointed COO, cleared his throat and slid a document across the table. "We've gone through every transaction Langley authorized in the last 6 months. It's worse than we thought." Jonathan flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the numbers. Large sums had been funneled into what appeared to be legitimate investment vehicles. But upon closer inspection, the funds had been rerouted. Shell companies, offshore accounts, and suspiciously timed trades. It all pointed to something much bigger than Langley acting alone. The legal team had traced the movement of money to an anonymous private investment firm that had recently acquired a sizable stake in Carter Hospitality. What stood out wasn't just the amount, but the timing. The bulk of the transactions had taken place just weeks before Langley had been ousted. Jonathan exhaled slowly. "Who owns the firm?" One of the attorneys, a woman in her late 40s with a sharp analytical mind, hesitated before answering. "We dug into their holdings. Most of it is buried under layers of corporate structures. But one name stood out." She passed another document forward. Jonathan looked down and felt the familiar surge of recognition. Everett Shaw. The name alone brought back memories. A decade ago, Jonathan and Shaw had been locked in a brutal battle for ownership of a luxury hotel chain. Shaw had played dirty, leaking false reports to the press, pressuring shareholders to turn against Jonathan, and using legal loopholes to tie up acquisitions in endless litigation. It had been a drawn-out war, and while Jonathan had ultimately won, he had never underestimated Shaw's ability to hold a grudge. And now, he was back. Jonathan set the document down and looked around the table. "Shaw owns 15% of Carter Hospitality?" Daniel nodded. "He's been acquiring shares quietly over the past year. Nothing illegal, but definitely calculated. With Langley on the inside, he could have been setting up for a takeover." It all made sense now. Langley hadn't just been covering his own tracks, he had been working towards something much larger. Shaw must have promised him a way back into power, using corporate maneuvering instead of direct confrontation. Langley's reckless moves had simply sped up the process. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his mind already moving to the next step. Shaw was still out there, and he wouldn't have given up just because Langley had been removed. If anything, he was likely regrouping, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Jonathan glanced at the legal team. "I want a full report on Shaw's recent acquisitions and any pending regulatory filings. If he's planning something, we need to see it before it happens." One of the forensic accountants added, "If Langley was working with him, there may be more players involved. We should assume Shaw has other allies within the company." Jonathan's jaw tightened. Langley had been a battle. Shaw would be a war. He stood up, adjusting the cuffs of his suit. "We don't wait for him to make the next move. We go on offense." The room fell silent as the weight of the statement settled over them. The fight for Carter Hospitality wasn't over. It had just entered a new phase. Jonathan Carter stood at the window of his office, looking out over the New York skyline. The city had always been a battlefield, a place where fortunes were made and destroyed in boardrooms, in whispered deals, in contracts signed behind closed doors. And now, Carter Hospitality was at the center of a war that would decide its future. Everett Shaw had made his move. The man had been lurking in the shadows for months, and now he was stepping into the light. His tactic was clear: buy up as much stock as possible, drive up share prices, and create uncertainty among investors. A company in turmoil was a company vulnerable to takeover. The rumors circulating in the financial press only fueled the fire. Reports speculated that Jonathan was losing his grip, that the board was growing impatient, that Carter Hospitality was on the verge of caving under the weight of its internal struggles. Jonathan turned away from the window. He had no time to waste. The conference room was already filled when he entered. Daniel Whitmore, his COO, sat at his right. Across the table were members of the legal team, auditors, and a few key board members who had yet to fully commit to either side. These were the people who would decide whether Carter Hospitality remained in his hands or fell into Shaw's. Jonathan wasted no time. We have less than 48 hours before the board meeting, he said. By then, Shaw will have solidified his position. If we don't act now, he'll have the leverage he needs to force a leadership change. A woman from the legal team spoke first. We're close to completing the financial investigation into Langley. Preliminary findings suggest he diverted funds into external accounts linked to investment firms that have connections to Shaw. If we can prove Shaw was complicit in the fraud, we don't have time for a full legal case. Daniel interjected. Shaw doesn't need to win in court. He just needs to convince the board that Jonathan is weak. We have to hit him before he has a chance to take control of the narrative. Jonathan nodded. Then we fight on two fronts. First, the financial strike. He ordered the audit team to finalize their report and prepare to submit a formal complaint to regulatory authorities. If Langley had indeed committed financial misconduct under Shaw's direction, they needed to bring it to light, fast. At the very least, it would force Shaw to go on the defensive. Second, the counter-offensive in the media. Jonathan's PR team would release a detailed statement outlining the reforms Carter Hospitality had undergone, emphasizing the company's renewed commitment to transparency. But that wasn't enough. They needed to control the narrative. A well-placed interview with a trusted business journalist would allow Jonathan to frame Shaw as a corporate raider with no interest in the company's long-term success. Daniel glanced at him. And the shareholders? Jonathan exhaled. I need to meet with them personally. In the next 24 hours, Jonathan arranged private conversations with the company's largest independent shareholders. He laid everything out. Shaw's history of asset stripping, the risk of losing Carter Hospitality's core values, the evidence linking Langley's misconduct to outside influence. Most were reluctant to take sides, but Jonathan appealed to their bottom line. Stability meant higher long-term returns. A hostile takeover would only bring chaos. Then came the final battle, the emergency board meeting. Everett Shaw arrived in style, walking into the conference room with the confidence of a man who had already won. He took his seat, his expression unreadable. Jonathan, he said smoothly, I think we can both agree that Carter Hospitality has seen better days. The shareholders deserve leadership that can navigate this company through uncertain times. Jonathan met his gaze, unwavering, and that's exactly what they have. Shaw smirked. The board may not agree, which is why we're here. The discussion turned into a battlefield of words. Shaw argued that the company's financials were unstable, that stockholder confidence was waning, and that a change at the top was inevitable. Jonathan countered with the truth. Under his leadership, customer satisfaction was at an all-time high, and the reforms were strengthening the company's foundation. Then Jonathan played his final card. He slid a folder across the table. This is the report from our internal audit. It details the financial mismanagement under Robert Langley. It also shows direct links between Langley's transactions and investment firms controlled by you. Everett. A murmur spread across the room. Some board members exchanged glances. Jonathan continued. These findings are being forwarded to regulators. If the board decides to move forward with your proposal, They do so knowing they're aligning with a man under investigation for financial misconduct. Shaw's smirk faded. The room fell silent as Eleanor Briggs, the chairwoman, looked around at the board members. We will now proceed with the vote. The decision was made. Jonathan remained CEO. Shaw, realizing he had lost, stood without a word and left the room. His fight wasn't over, but for now, Carter Hospitality remained in the hands of the man who built it. Jonathan exhaled, leaning back in his chair. The war had been won. But he knew better than anyone, peace in business was always temporary. The conference room was silent except for the quiet tapping of fingers against polished wood. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that settled before a storm. Every member of the board was present, some leaning forward with hands clasped, others sitting back, arms crossed, their expressions unreadable. At the far end of the table, Everett Shaw sat with an easy confidence, one leg crossed over the other, his fingers idly drumming against the armrest of his chair. Jonathan Carter remained standing, his posture unwavering as he met Shaw's gaze. This was it, the moment that would determine the future of Carter Hospitality Group. Shaw was the first to speak, his voice smooth, calculated. We all know why we're here. The uncertainty surrounding this company has reached a boiling point. The shareholders are watching, the press is watching, and frankly, gentlemen and ladies, it is our responsibility to ensure that Carter Hospitality is led by someone who can inspire confidence in the market. He gestured toward the room with a slight, almost theatrical movement of his hand. We can all see the numbers. Since Jonathan's so-called reforms began, we've experienced a decline in revenue. The stock has fluctuated wildly. Clients are hesitant. Investors are nervous. The board must ask itself a difficult but necessary question. Can we afford to continue down this path? He leaned forward, his expression serious now. I propose a vote of no confidence. If Jonathan fails to secure majority support, I will put forth a new candidate for CEO. Someone who can stabilize this company and ensure its future. A murmur spread across the room. Some board members nodded slightly. Others glanced toward Jonathan. Shaw had set his trap well. He wasn't outright demanding power, he was framing it as a logical choice. One that any rational business leader would make. Jonathan exhaled, slowly, then picked up a folder and placed it on the table. He didn't sit. Instead, he rested both hands on the table's surface and spoke. His voice steady. You're right about one thing, Everett. The shareholders are watching. The public is watching. But what they're watching isn't uncertainty, it's a test. A test of whether this company stands for something more than just short-term profit. A test of whether we let men like you dismantle it for personal gain. He opened the folder, sliding a series of documents toward Eleanor Briggs, who had remained quiet until now. Her expression darkened as she scanned the pages, then passed them to the next board member. One by one, the documents made their way around the room. These are the final findings from our internal investigation into Robert Langley's financial misconduct. Jonathan continued. Langley didn't just embezzle company funds. He was working with external investors to undermine Carter Hospitality from the inside. And those investors weren't just nameless entities. He stepped away from the table, walking toward the projector screen as a set of email exchanges appeared. Their subject lines stark and damning. Langley's name, and Shaw's. A hush fell over the room as the realization dawned. In these emails, Langley details a plan to sabotage my leadership, distort financial reports, and create an artificial sense of instability. Jonathan continued. He was promised protection, a return to power, under different management. He turned back to Shaw. You. Everett Shaw's fingers tightened around the armrest, but his expression barely flickered. He was too experienced, too careful. Eleanor Briggs, who had been silent through most of the meeting, finally spoke. Everett, you came to this board under the pretense of saving Carter Hospitality. But what I see here suggests you never intended to save it at all. You intended to gut it. She placed the documents down and met his gaze. Are you denying any of this? Shaw exhaled sharply, shaking his head with a small chuckle. Jonathan always was a man who knew how to play theatrics. Let's not be naive. This is business. We all do what's necessary to secure our investments. Jonathan let the silence stretch. Let Shaw's words linger in the air, exposing themselves for what they were. Eleanor turned toward the board. I believe it's time we vote. Not on Jonathan's leadership, but on whether Mr. Shaw has a place in this company. The results came in swiftly. Unanimous. Everett Shaw had lost. The billionaire's jaw tightened, but he nodded once. Composed. He knew when he was beaten. He rose to his feet, buttoning his jacket. This isn't over, Jonathan, he murmured as he passed him. Jonathan didn't smile. It is for you. Shaw walked out without another word. As the door closed behind him, Eleanor turned to Jonathan. It seems Carter Hospitality is still yours to lead. Jonathan sat down for the first time since the meeting began. He could feel the weight lifting, but he knew better than to think it was over. The fight for integrity was never truly won. It was something that had to be defended. Day after day, later that night, as he sat in his office, a new email arrived. It was from Eleanor. We won today, but there will always be men like Shaw. Stay ready. Jonathan read the words twice, then leaned back in his chair. He wasn't just ready. He was waiting. Respect isn't just for the people we think matter, it's for everyone. This story proves that power isn't always obvious, and the way we treat others can come back to shape our own fate. So, if no one was watching, how would you act? Would you still choose kindness? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to Undercover Truths for more eye-opening stories that reveal the hidden battles for justice.